March 23, 1960, in the VIP lounge of the Sands Hotel Casino in Las Vegas, a wealthy casino owner used a racial slur against Sammy Davis Jr. that made the entire room go silent. But what Elvis Presley did in the next 60 seconds didn't just shock everyone in that room, it revealed something about his character that most people never knew existed. Las Vegas in 1960 was a strange paradox. On the surface, it was the entertainment capital of the world where the biggest stars performed to sold-out crowds every night. The Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop were at the absolute peak of their powers, filling the Sands Hotel showroom night after night with their blend of music, comedy, and cool sophistication. But underneath the glamour and the glitz, Las Vegas was still a deeply segregated city. Black performers could entertain white audiences, but they couldn't stay in the hotels where they performed. They couldn't eat in the restaurants. They even couldn't use the front entrance. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most talented entertainers in the world, a man who could sing, dance, act, and do impressions better than almost anyone alive, still had to enter the Sands through the kitchen. Elvis Presley had been in Vegas doing a series of shows at the New Frontier Hotel. His movie career was taking off, but he still loved performing live, feeding off the energy of an audience. On this particular night, he'd finished his show early and had been invited to the Sands to watch the Rat Pack perform and maybe hang out afterwards. The Rat Pack show that night had been electric. Frank had been in rare form. Dean was hilarious as always, and Sammy had brought the house down with his impressions and his singing. After the show, a select group of people were invited to the VIP lounge, a private area backstage where the stars could relax, have drinks, and decompress without the public watching. Elvis was sitting on a couch nursing a Coca-Cola and talking with Dean Martin about their upcoming film projects. Sammy was across the room, still in his tuxedo, energized from the performance, laughing and joking with some of the other performers. Frank was holding court in the center of the room, telling stories that had everyone cracking up. The VIP lounge was invitation only, but money and power could open doors that talent sometimes couldn't. One of the people who walked in that night was a man named Harold Beckman, the owner of 3 major casinos in Vegas. Beckman was in his 50s, overweight with slick-back hair and an expensive suit that couldn't hide his crude personality. He was the kind of man who thought his money entitled him to say and do whatever he wanted. Beckman walked into the lounge like he owned it, which in a sense he kind of did. He owned a piece of the Sands and everyone knew he had the kind of power that could make or break careers in Las Vegas. He greeted Frank with exaggerated familiarity, slapped Dean on the back, and then his eyes landed on Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy was in the middle of telling a story, his hands animated, his infectious energy making everyone around him smile. Beckman walked over, drink in hand, and interrupted. "Hey, Sammy," Beckman said, his voice loud enough that people across the room could hear. "Great show tonight. You people sure know how to entertain." There was something in the way he said, "you people," that made a few heads turn. Sammy, ever the professional, smiled and nodded. "Thanks, Mr. Beckman. Glad you enjoyed it." Beckman took a long drink and then said something that made the entire room go silent. "Yeah, you put on a good show, but you know what? At the end of the day, you're still just another N-word in a tuxedo." The room froze. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. The laughter died. Everyone turned to look at Beckman, then at Sammy, trying to process what they just heard. Sammy's face changed in an instant. The smile disappeared. His eyes went wide, not with anger, but with shock and pain. For a man who had faced racism his entire life, who had dealt with slurs and hatred and discrimination since he was a child performing in vaudeville, you'd think he'd have developed some kind of armor against it. But the truth about that kind of hate is that it never stops hurting. It just cuts you open again and again. No matter how many times you've been cut before, Sammy stood there frozen. His mouth opened like he was going to say something. But no words came out. He was in shock, unable to process that someone had just said that to him. Here in this room, surrounded by his friends and colleagues, Frank Sinatra, who had been across the room, started moving toward Beckman, his face darkening with anger. Dean Martin put down his drink, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced with tension. Everyone in the room was waiting to see what would happen next. But before Frank could reach Beckman, before anyone else could react, Elvis stood up. Elvis had been sitting quietly in the corner. But the moment those words came out of Beckman's mouth, something changed in him. He set down his Coca-Cola carefully, like he was afraid if he didn't put it down gently, he might throw it. And then he walked across the room with a purpose that made everyone step back. Elvis positioned himself between Beckman and Sammy, not aggressively, but protectively. He wasn't a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to take up all the space in the room. "Mr. Beckman," Elvis said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the silent lounge. His southern accent was more pronounced than usual, the way it got when he was emotional. "I'm going to need you to repeat what you just said because I don't think I heard you correctly." Beckman, emboldened by alcohol and his own sense of power, smirked. "You heard me, Elvis. I said he's just another." Elvis held up his hand, cutting him off. "No," Elvis said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge like broken glass. "I'm going to stop you right there, because what you're about to say is going to determine whether you walk out of this room on your own 2 feet or get carried out." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Beckman laughed nervously, looking around the room for support. "Come on, Elvis. I'm just joking around. Sammy knows I'm kidding. Right, Sammy?" Sammy still hadn't moved, still standing there processing what was happening. Elvis took a step closer to Beckman. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Beckman, and I want everyone in this room to hear it. Sammy Davis Jr. is more of a man than you will ever be. He's got more talent in his little finger than you've got in your entire body. He's got more class, more dignity, and more courage than a coward like you could ever understand." The room was absolutely silent. Frank Sinatra was watching with his arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. Dean Martin was nodding. Everyone else was in shock. Nobody talked to Harold Beckman like this. The man controlled too much of Vegas. But Elvis wasn't done. "You know what the difference is between you and Sammy?" Elvis continued, his voice getting stronger. "Sammy earned everything he has. Every standing ovation, every dollar, every bit of respect. He earned it by being better than everyone else. By working harder than everyone else. By having to be twice as good just to be treated half as well. What have you earned, Mr. Beckman? You inherited money from your daddy and bought your way into respectability. But you can't buy what Sammy has. You can't buy talent. You can't buy dignity. And you sure as hell can't buy the right to disrespect him in front of his friends." Beckman's face was red now, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Now wait just a minute, Elvis. You don't know who you're talking to. I can make one phone call and then what?" Elvis interrupted. "You'll make sure I never work in Vegas again. You'll blacklist me. Go ahead, make that call. Because I'd rather never set foot in this city again than spend one more second in the same room with a man who thinks his money gives him permission to treat people like they're less than human." Elvis turned and looked at everyone in the room, making eye contact with each person. "And that goes for everyone here. If you're okay with what this man just said, if you think that's acceptable behavior, then you're no friend of mine. But if you're as disgusted as I am, if you believe that no man should ever be spoken to that way, then I suggest you make your feelings known right now." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Frank Sinatra walked over and stood next to Elvis facing Beckman. "Get out," Frank said simply. "You're not welcome here." Dean Martin joined them. "You heard the man. Get out." One by one, other people in the room moved to stand with Elvis in the Rat Pack. A silent but powerful show of unity. Within seconds, Harold Beckman was standing alone on one side of the room, facing a wall of people who had just collectively decided he didn't belong. Beckman looked around, his arrogance finally cracking. "You're all making a big mistake," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I own this town. You all work for people like me." "No," Elvis said quietly. "We work for the people who pay money to see us perform. We work for the fans who love the music and the entertainment. We work for our families and ourselves. We don't work for bullies and bigots. Now get out before we throw you out." Beckman stood there for another moment, maybe calculating whether his money and power could salvage this situation. But looking at the faces staring back at him, he apparently decided it wasn't worth it. He turned and walked toward the door, trying to maintain some dignity, but everyone could see his hand shaping. Just before he reached the door, Elvis called out one more time. "Mr. Beckman." Beckman turned around and Elvis said, "I want you to know something. Every time you see my name on a marquee, every time you hear my music on the radio, every time you see Sammy perform to a standing ovation, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember the night you showed everyone in this room exactly what kind of man you really are. And I want you to remember that you have to live with that for the rest of your life. We don't." Beckman left without another word. The door closed behind him. And for a long moment, the room stayed silent. Then Elvis turned to Sammy, who still hadn't moved, still processing everything that had just happened. Sam Duncan's eyes were shining with tears, but he was also smiling, this complicated expression of pain and gratitude and disbelief. Elvis walked over to him and put his hand on his shoulder. "You okay, brother?" That word, brother, spoken with such genuine warmth and meaning, broke something open in Sammy. He pulled Elvis into a hug, and the two men stood there holding each other while the room watched in respectful silence. When they finally pulled apart, Sammy wiped his eyes and looked at Elvis with an expression of wonder. "You," Sammy said, his voice thick with emotion. "You really are the king. Not because of your music or your movies, but because of what you just did. Nobody has ever stood up for me like that. Not like that." Elvis shook his head. "Sammy, you're my friend. You're my brother. And brothers protect each other. That's all I was doing." Frank Sinatra walked over and put his arms around both of them. "That," he said, "was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Elvis, you just showed everyone in this room what real class looks like." The mood in the lounge shifted. The tension that had filled the air moments before was replaced by something else. Warmth, solidarity, a sense that something important had just happened, that a line had been drawn and everyone had chosen the right side of it. Someone turned the music back on. Drinks were refilled. Conversation slowly started up again, but everyone kept glancing at Elvis and Sammy, still standing together, still talking quietly. About an hour later, someone suggested they all go down to the showroom. The official shows were over for the night, but why not do an impromptu performance just for fun, just for each other? And that's how at 2:30 in the morning on March 24, 1960, about 50 people witnessed one of the most remarkable performances that never made it into the history books. Elvis and Sammy Davis Jr. took the stage at the Sands Hotel showroom and sang together. They did gospel songs, old standards, and they talked between songs about music and friendship and what it meant to be an entertainer. Sammy told the small audience what Elvis had done upstairs, and the applause lasted for over a minute. Elvis, embarrassed by the attention, tried to deflect by joking about it, but Sammy wouldn't let him. "This deserves it," Sammy said. "Let him hear it." When the impromptu show finally ended around 4 a.m., Sammy caught Elvis before he left. He pulled a ring off his finger, a simple gold band that he'd worn for years. "I want you to have this," Sammy said. "It's not much, but it means something to me. I want you to wear it and remember that you've got a brother who will never forget what you did tonight." Elvis tried to refuse, but Sammy insisted. So Elvis took the ring, slipped it on his finger, and wore it for years afterwards. People who knew him said that whenever someone asked about it, Elvis would tell them the story, always making sure to emphasize Sam Dunk's talent and character, never dwelling on his own actions. The story of what happened in the Sands Hotel VIP lounge that night was kept relatively quiet for years. The people who were there talked about it among themselves, but it wasn't the kind of story that made the papers. This was 1960. Racism was rarely talked about openly, especially not when it involved wealthy casino owners and famous entertainers. But within the entertainment community, the story spread. It became one of those legends that people told to illustrate who Elvis really was when the cameras weren't rolling. Other performers who heard the story said it changed how they thought about using their platform and their fame to stand up for what was right. Frank Sinatra, who had his own complicated history with civil rights and racial issues, later said that watching Elvis that night taught him something important. Elvis didn't make a big political statement, Frank said in an interview years later. He didn't give a speech about civil rights or equality. He just saw his friend being hurt and he stood up for him. Sometimes that's more powerful than any speech or protest. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is just treat people like human beings and refuse to accept anything less from others. The friendship between Elvis and Sammy lasted for the rest of their lives. They remained close, supported each other's careers, and spoke about each other with genuine affection and respect. Sammy would later credit Elvis with helping him understand that true friendship crosses all boundaries, that the bonds formed by mutual respect and shared values are stronger than the division society tries to impose. As for Harold Beckman, his influence in Las Vegas diminished over the following years. Whether it was because word of what happened got around or just the natural evolution of the industry, his power waned. He sold his casino interests in the late 1960s and moved away from Vegas. He died in obscurity in 1978, remembered by few and mourned by fewer. The story of Elvis and Sammy that night reminds us that courage isn't always about grand gestures or public stands. Sometimes courage is about seeing injustice happening right in front of you and refusing to stay silent, even when it might cost you something. Elvis knew that standing up to Harold Beckman could have consequences. Beckman did have power and influence. He could have made things difficult for Elvis in Las Vegas. But Elvis also knew that some things are more important than career considerations or business relationships. Human dignity is one of those things. Friendship is one of those things. And the simple principle that no one should ever be demeaned because of their race is one of those things. What makes this story particularly powerful is that Elvis didn't do it for publicity or recognition. He did it because it was right. He did it because Sammy was his friend and his brother. And you don't let people hurt your brothers. He did it because he was raised to believe that all people are equal in God's eyes. And treating someone as less than human was a sin he couldn't abide. In the decades since that night, as America has grappled with its long history of racism and continues to struggle with issues of equality and justice, the story of Elvis and Sammy has taken on new resonance. It serves as a reminder that progress happens not just through laws and protests, though those are important, but also through individual moments of courage, through people deciding that they will not tolerate hatred and bigotry in their presence. The ring that Sammy gave Elvis that night was found among Elvis's possessions after he died. It was one of the items he kept close, one of the things that apparently meant something special to him. When Lisa Marie Presley saw it years later and asked about it, Priscilla told her the story, making sure that the next generation understood who Elvis really was, not just as a performer, but as a man. Today, when people talk about Elvis Presley's legacy, they usually focus on his music, his performances, his impact on popular culture. And all of that is important and deserves to be celebrated. But maybe the moments that reveal the most about who Elvis really was are the ones that didn't happen on stage or in front of cameras. Maybe the truest measure of the man is found in a VIP lounge at 2 a.m. Standing between a friend and a bully, refusing to let hatred win. If this incredible story of courage, friendship, and standing up for what's right moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of using your voice to defend others. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that reveal true character.